Welcome to the Underground Strategy Podcast. My name is Max, and today we're joined by one of the top military historians out there, Professor John McManus. And together we're going to explore the brutal fighting in the Ardennes during the early days of the Battle of the Bulge, focusing on the critical but often overlooked actions by the American troops who held the line before the 101st Airborne Division arrived in Bastogne. John's book, Alamo in the Ardennes, brings these crucial moments to life and shows how they decisively shaped the battle. John, great to have you here. Let's start from the beginning. What led you to write this book?
Yeah, well, first off, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to talk to you guys. And yeah, the book, the original kernel of an idea actually came when I was on a tour of Europe for the 60th anniversary of Normandy. And it was not just a Normandy tour. It was a tour that went, basically Normandy to the end of the war. And that took us through some of the Battle of the Bulge battlefields. And that included, of course, Bastogne. And what stood out to me is I was at Bastogne with several 101st Airborne Division veterans who, of course, had fought there. And they, I think, very selflessly made the point over and over and over. They said, yeah, we were here for the siege and we fought the Germans off that way. But there was a lot going on before we ever got here. And those guys who were filtering back, who we saw, who we know had been in a lot of fighting, that's sort of, in a way, the real story of Bastogne. And that was really intriguing to me. So when I came home, I explored that more. And I found that one of the veterans of that particular battle, a guy named Bob Phillips, had written a book called To Save Bastogne. And he had actually been in the 110th Infantry Regiment of the 28th Infantry Division, which really fought almost to extinction in the Bastogne corridor to buy time for the 101st to get to the town for the famous siege. And so that's what really began the whole thing for me. Bob was very welcoming and shared a lot of great info with me, put me in touch with a lot of folks. And I think he was excited that I was interested in that phase of the Bastogne battle, because I think our popular memory has been very, very different, that we tend to center on the 101st. And I would argue, really, by the time the 101st gets there, to some extent, the race for Bastogne had been decided. It doesn't make their experience any easier, any less important, but it's sort of entering a new phase by the time they get there, I guess.
It really is a very interesting episode that you draw out in the book. And I just want to first say that I really enjoyed this book. And, without going too far, the writing sounds really good and perhaps a little bit unconventional. And, could you maybe give us a few lines from that introduction? You introduce Colonel Fuller in there, and I'm just thinking our listeners will really appreciate that.
Yeah, so bear with me while I cue this up, because Colonel Hurley Fuller is such an interesting guy. So by way of explanation, he was the commander of the 110th Infantry Regiment of the 28th Division, which really just by happenstance ends up right at the epicenter of the German offensive, the push for Bastogne, that part of the German offensive. And, his regiment is just getting, clobbered by multiple German units and is fighting so hard. So the introduction of the book, I thought, should be through his eyes, and just read a little bit of it. 1825 hours, December 17th, 1944, the Clervaux Hotel, Clervaux, Luxembourg. Colonel Hurley Fuller was angry, scared, and exhausted. The past 36 hours had been the most horrendous and stressful of his life, and he had been through plenty of bad situations. I mean, I think right there, that tells you a lot about this guy. He's been through a lot of bad situations, but this is really the worst thing he's faced.
And it's such a good hook over there, because you go on to explain a little bit about his background, right? And I think you say he's been kind of a middle-of-the-road officer, if I can put it that way, cantankerous, but kind of efficient still.
Yeah, he's competent. He's dedicated. He's fought in World War I. He had once attended the University of Texas, and he had basically left the university to go and fight in World War I. He'd seen combat there, and he had really committed to being a soldier. And his career had kind of steadily progressed, but he's not like one of these superstars we focus on, in retrospect. He, of course, never became a general. And like you said, Tony, he is a kind of a middle-of-the-road officer. He certainly is a quality officer and competent, but he's not necessarily innovative or dynamic or inspiring in any way. He's solid, but he's also cantankerous, maybe his own worst enemy in a way. He's a bit brusque. So he's really been through the ringer by December 17th, 1944, because he had commanded a regiment in Normandy, the 23rd Infantry Regiment of the 2nd Division, which, by the way, is just an amazing unit with a great history. And they'd had a tough time in the fighting around Saint-Lô, particularly around like Hill 192. And he got relieved at the time, and so obviously that was devastating to him, in addition, obviously, to the casualties that his unit had taken. And so he had been kind of in the netherworld ever since, looking for a regimental command, and he gets one shortly before the Battle of the Bulge begins. So be careful what you wish for, because now he ends up in an extremely difficult situation.
John, staying on Fuller for a second, you mentioned he was relieved of his command earlier in Normandy, which clearly affected him deeply, but do we know exactly why he was relieved? Was it purely about battlefield results, or were there other factors at play here?
Right. And the reason was, in that immediate aftermath of the success of the Omaha Beach invasion, most of the orientation for what was called Fifth Corps, those are the units that come ashore at Omaha on D-Day and thereafter, most of it was centered around trying to take the town of Saint-Lô, which is about, 15, 16 miles inland, something like that. And it's a key crossroads town. Well, it took Fifth Corps the better part of about, 5 weeks or so to do this. And in the meantime, you're looking at just a terrible bloodbath in the hedgerow country and some of the hills in that part of Normandy. And so Fuller's unit, the 23rd, was deeply enmeshed in this, and he's kind of held accountable for the fact that he's just not gaining ground. It's a pretty ruthless environment in the U.S. Army sometimes in World War II of commanders getting fired almost with impunity. He had this one little predilection, which I don't think served him particularly well. I think, at least this is my impression, he had a bit of a skepticism over the M1 Garand rifle, which to him was this newfangled weapon. He preferred what he thought was the more solid and reliable 03 Springfield. And so you'll notice that in Normandy, there's a sort of preponderance of American riflemen in the 23rd Infantry who are armed with the Springfield. Well, that's a bolt-action rifle versus the semi-automatic fire of the M1 Garand. The Garand is a better weapon, really, unless you're sniping, I suppose. So I do think maybe that's something that created at least the feeling among some higher-ups that he wasn't quite in tune with the times. I don't know if it's fair, but maybe that's a contributory factor to what happened when he got fired. I don't know that for sure, though.
That does make sense. And I'm just thinking, when you have someone like that, and it's almost like he gets a second chance, although one has to take that for what it is, a very difficult situation for his second chance. And when one reads the book, you can almost feel the frustration of Fuller, as he reaches out to General Cota, asking for reinforcements. It doesn't come. And could you just paint us a picture for our listeners of what was happening, and then perhaps read that iconic line where he references the Alamo?
Yeah, so, the German offensive begins, obviously, on December 16th, 1944. And, of course, from that morning forward, the 110th Infantry is just under attack constantly from multiple German units. And the pattern tended to be the 110th was sort of widely dispersed in choke point towns and their environs around that part of the Ardennes that borders with Germany, between Luxembourg and Germany. And so a lot of these companies were getting enveloped and sort of besieged, and they're fighting as best they can. Now, Fuller is back in Clervaux, as I had mentioned in reading that passage, which is the regimental headquarters. That's a few miles behind the lines, this charming little resort town where GIs had gone for R&R during the run-up to the Bulge. And so he's there in that hotel and trying to manage this battle, trying to get reinforcements, trying to impress upon higher-ups the situation. And it's the classic thing of, and I think this happens a lot, it seems to me, in combat or in a military environment of, here we are, we're really dealing with the situation, higher up just doesn't get it, and this exasperation with higher command. And so, from his standpoint, he's been trying to impress upon Major General Norman Cota, who's the division commander, and by the way, was famous for D-Day as well, for Omaha Beach and all that, and his incredible valor there had gotten him a division command. Well, Fuller was convinced that Cota didn't quite understand the situation, that he needed to provide him more help. Cota, on the other hand, is managing things from his level too, and is doing what he can. So Fuller, of course, being Fuller, has reached a point of total exasperation by that evening of December 17th, and he's on the phone with Cota's chief of staff, a colonel named Gibney. And Gibney seems skeptical about the seriousness of the situation. And what's happening is that there are German tanks that have entered Clervaux by that point in time. They are nearing the Clervaux Hotel where the regimental headquarters is located. So there's actually, booming and explosions and whatnot going on. And so Gibney hears one as one of these tanks unleashes a shell that goes down the hallway of this hotel. It's kind of surreal. And he's like, what was that? And Fuller's like, yeah, what do you think it is? He's just so exasperated. And so he, there's not that much that Gibney really can do for him from the distance of division headquarters several miles away. And so the last part of that part of the book that I write about, I say about Fuller, even as he scrambled into action at the Clervaux, thousands of other American soldiers all over the Bastogne corridor were dealing with the same furious German onslaught, fighting for their lives. Somewhere out there in the darkness, each and every one of them was experiencing his own Alamo in the Ardennes, which is why I called the book that title, but also the other subplot to that. Fuller was from Texas, and so it occurred to him as he was dealing with the situation that he was in a situation like Colonel Travis at the Alamo, and he even said that. And he says that in his conversation with Gibney, and so I heard that too and thought, oh, there it is. That's perfect. But that's certainly the way Fuller viewed it at that moment in time.
The way you described Fuller's desperate situation really puts us right there with him. And I'd like to jump briefly to the opening of chapter 1 in your book, because it captures how these battles left lasting scars on the soldiers involved. And you write like this: "The Hurtgen forest was a horrible nightmare, but it was over now. For some, it was over because they were dead. But for the living, Hurtgen was now just a bitter memory that would never really fade." That really gives us a strong and haunting image, and it immediately brings home how traumatic this must have been for the soldiers on the ground. Could you tell us more about what the 28th Division experienced there and how it set the stage for the Battle of the Bulge?
Yeah, absolutely. So the 28th Infantry Division had come ashore about a month or so after D-Day over Omaha Beach as part of 5th Corps. And so this is like July 1944. They'd fought in Normandy, particularly at a hill mass called 112. Once the Battle of Normandy is over, they move on and they fight in the Siegfried Line. But we've all seen, by the way, I'm sure, the pictures of GIs parading down the Champs-Élysées in Paris. And those are 28th Division soldiers. So they got to have that enjoyable moment. But then they're fighting hard in the Siegfried Line pillboxes and fortifications that were defending the western border of Germany. Okay, well, that's like September, October. Their next assignment was to go into what was called the Hurtgen Forest, which I was referring to there in that part of chapter 1. And this is November 1944. The weather was starting to go sideways. So by that, I mean, it's rainy, it's muddy, it's 38 degrees, that kind of thing. It's very raw. It's cloudy and gloomy. Your close air support is pretty much negated. And here you are as a division kind of just plunging into this pretty well defended forest. And it is an absolute unmitigated bloodbath. The 28th Division fights there and they suffer, over 6,000 casualties to gain next to nothing. The toll on small unit leaders is absolutely immense. If you were a platoon leader and you lasted 4 or 5 days in the Hurtgen Forest, you were absolutely beating the odds. It was just so horrible, in part because of the weather, but also the tree burst effect. The German artillery would explode in the trees, and that would multiply the fragmentation effect. Not to mention the mud made it difficult to have footing. And of course, you're negating a lot of your artillery support, your mobility of your vehicles and mechanization and tanks. And, when they're using tanks there, they just can't maneuver very well. And so the 28th was just shattered in the Hurtgen Forest. And that's why the division had been sent to this part of the Ardennes Forest, which was supposedly going to be a quiet sector where they can kind of rest and refit and get over this horrid nightmare that was the Hurtgen Forest.
If you're dialed in, drop us a review on your app. Watching on YouTube, hit subscribe to join the conversation. All right, back to it.
And then just building on that point about the Ardennes, it's a forest, it's a terrain feature, it's kind of critical. The Germans use it in 1940, they achieve surprise. Then in 44, again, I'm going to put inverted commas or air quotes surprise. And as you write, General Bradley called the Ardennes a calculated risk, and Eisenhower said that the Allies couldn't be strong everywhere. But then, as in 1940, Hitler again chooses the same place. And if you could just humor us again by reading us the first paragraph of chapter 2, which is Friday, December 15th, the clock was ticking. And for our listeners, this book is chronological and it goes through this week in a lot of detail, painting the different elements. But then if you could just, John, please give us a bit of background on what was happening on the German side, on the American side, and how it played out.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll read the paragraph first and then there's a lot of layers of context to this and that are really interesting, I think. And so as you mentioned, Tony, the book is very much almost like real time as you would experience. It is chronological day by day and almost to some extent hour by hour without just saying, and then this happened, and then this happened. It's sort of overlapping all these different experiences that people had almost concurrently, which is a challenge. But yeah, so the second chapter starts. It's the clock was ticking. All over the Ardennes, timepieces were grinding on, marking the last quiet hours, oblivious to what lay ahead. As they had done for so many days in this quiet sector, American soldiers carried on with their routines, at times casually glancing at their wristwatches, none of them knowing that these were the last precious hours of surcease. The Ardennes was about to change forever. The soldiers were too. And so, how we've gotten to that point, you may have heard of an operation called Market Garden, which happened in September 1944, in which the Allies tried a combined airborne armored operation to seize key bridges in the Netherlands over some of the major river systems so that they get into northern Germany and outflank the Siegfried Line, so on and so forth. So when that happened, Hitler decided he was going to launch his own counteroffensive. So what we know is the Battle of the Bulge grows out of Hitler's reaction to Market Garden. And so all that fall, the Germans had been building up a lot of their strength to attack in the Ardennes forest. And as you said, the Germans had attacked there in 1940, quite famously, and they decided they're going to go back there. Well, the reason that this is a pretty decent place for the Germans to push in December is if we're looking at the macro level, the Allies are really starting to run into manpower problems by December 1944. I mean, of course, famously, the British are more or less running out. And the Americans certainly have some level of manpower, but they've suffered terrible casualties. And a lot of the manpower the Americans have has been earmarked to other things besides frontline ground combat soldiers, particularly infantry. And yet we end up in this situation in which, it's been a meat grinder and we need to replace casualties, and they're not, the replacements aren't there. And so a lot of our formations along that front, by the time the Bulge attack happens, are pretty hollow. And so Generals Bradley and Eisenhower know this. So they know like you said, they can't be strong everywhere. And they figure the rough terrain of the Ardennes, the heavy forest, the gorges, the narrow roads and choke point towns, that'll do some of our defending for us because we don't need as much manpower there. And it's hard to move vehicles and fight mechanized warfare there. So this ends up as a pretty thinly held line, though, at a place where the Germans are having this concentration of strength. And that's where the problems begin.
It is truly remarkable how quickly things were unraveling here. Fuller's frustration, commanders overwhelmed, and soldiers stretched thin. The Ardennes was shifting from calm to chaos in just a matter of hours. And you captured this shift at the start of chapter 3. It is Saturday, December 16th, and you write, at 0400 hours, the Ardennes front was dark. The air was cold, crisp, and moist, but not freezing. The German side of the Bastogne corridor was pregnant with danger. Thousands of German soldiers crossed the Our in small boats, building bridges across that river. That really paints an incredibly tense picture for us, with soldiers silently crossing a river in the pre-dawn hours, setting the stage for battle. Could you walk us through what happens next here?
Yeah, so this is what the Germans have been planning for several months. And some parts of the Ardennes, they're going to have an artillery barrage before they go forward. And other parts are not going to do that. They're going to creep forward and try and infiltrate the American lines. In this particular sector, the tendency is toward the latter. But one of the things the Germans do as they're sending their assault troops forward is to shine spotlights off the clouds. It's, of course, very cloudy. It's the Ardennes in mid-December. That's the way it tends to be. This was not a good move for them because it illuminated and silhouetted a lot of these guys who were coming forward who might otherwise have been able to conceal themselves in the darkness a little bit better. On the other hand, of course, too, it would have been harder for the German commanders to coordinate. So, so that's why they did the searchlight thing. It doesn't work out very well for them. So what happens, though, is that you've got a lot of American soldiers of the 28th Division, particularly the 110th, who are in outpost positions, either near the Ore River, maybe east of it, but more commonly west of it, just outside whatever town their company happens to be stationed in. And now, all of a sudden, they're getting attacked frontally or enveloped or whatever by just droves of German troops. Mainly, this is an infantry attack at this stage, because the Germans can't get their vehicles across the Ore River until they get a bridge up and running at a place called Dasburg. And that's much later in the day. So it's just this kind of stunning thing where the Germans all of a sudden are pushing forward. They're launching artillery in some places and not in others. It just kind of depends where you are. And, all that what I referred to is just pregnant with danger. Now here it is. I mean, it's coming straight at you. And it's quite stunning to many of the Americans.
Going from there, the 110th is in a pretty difficult situation. It's really dire. And Fuller is still lobbying General Cotter for additional support. And, it may have been the Alamo, and then, it's just the way you were explaining it there being this delaying action. It's possibly also a bit of Thermopylae. They're sacrificing themselves on this, on this choke point. And then when they eventually realize that, they're going to pay this very heavy price, can you walk us through what happens on December 17th?
Yeah, by then, of course, the battle has already been terribly costly for the 110th, but it's been costly for the Germans, too, certainly in terms of casualties, but more importantly, time. The key for any success for the Germans is that their offensive has to move very fast to capture key objectives, because the whole purpose of it is to cross the Meuse River and get to Antwerp and cut the Allied armies in two. And this was always a big ask, of course. So that meant everything had to basically go right. And already for the Germans, it was going quite wrong by December 17th, because you have so many of their units kind of bogged down in these fights or in and around these choke point towns that the 110th is denying them. And so what is really quite chilling about it, Max mentioned earlier about goosebumps, and this was true for me, is over and over and over, you see that the orders a lot of these guys are getting when they are in communication with higher headquarters is hold at all costs. And if you really kind of step back and you think about that for a minute, what that really means is they're telling you, we're not sure if we can help you or not. You have to fight to the end, and whatever that means. And I mean, I think it's easy for us to sit here 80 years later and just breeze over that. But when you think about yourself really being in that situation, that has to be the loneliest, most horrible, forlorn feeling in the world. And of course, for this book, I interviewed many, many veterans because, when I was researching it, a lot of them were still around. And certainly that's sort of the mood that many of them communicated to me. And I think it's a very human emotion that we would all feel in that situation.
I spent nearly 7 years in Afghanistan, and while I've experienced my fair share of intense moments, I never faced orders to hold a position at all costs. It's almost unimaginable today, maybe aside from parts of the Ukrainian front, of course. Otherwise, it's an extraordinary type of command to receive. So I'm going to move forward to December 18th. Now, Fuller's regiment was divided into smaller teams, not directly as a tactical choice, I guess, but because his unit was fragmenting into isolated groups due to the intense German pressure. He is clearly overwhelmed, and his men are fighting desperately to buy time for the 101st Airborne to reach Bastogne. Could you walk us through what is happening at this critical moment?
Yeah, so, I mean, and by the way, if you're 7 years in Afghanistan, my gosh, I mean, better than anybody then even if you never had that hold at all costs, better than anybody. The idea of just being your life in danger every single day like that, and then imagine these guys, right there at the spear point or epicenter, whatever we're calling it, that this offensive is just really, really staggering to think of, so, and very moving, I think, too, because, so many of these guys, they're just everyday Americans, and now they're in this situation. So, I guess the good news, and you probably wouldn't have known this if you're one of these soldiers fighting in these isolated actions, is some level of help is on the way. Eisenhower has figured out pretty quickly, and in part maybe because of Ultra, the ability to crack some of the German codes and get a sense of their thinking, although that doesn't come into play too much during, before the Bulge to warn us. But Eisenhower, I think, does have a sense that this is a major offensive. And so he's moving any units he can toward the Ardennes to react. And he lays hands on the first reserves he's got, and that's the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions that had, of course, just fought their guts out in the Netherlands in the fall of 1944 and were resting and refurbishing and replacing themselves. And so through a series of happenstance, the 101st, of course, ends up headed for Bastogne. Now, if we are in, say, I Company in the 110th Infantry 28th Division, we don't know that, of course. We know we need help. And so Coda has some level of support from tanks, like an attached tank battalion called the 707, that he's able to parcel out a little bit, and Fuller gets a little bit of that to throw into the battle and all that. But, again, that's just kind of a stopgap at this point. You also have some other reinforcements coming up from the south, Combat Command Reserve from the 9th Armored Division, who I think also, alongside the 28th, deserves a lot more, prominence in our historical memory about this whole fight. I mean, like any American armored division in that era, it's like a three-headed monster in a way. You've got three combat commands, A, B, and R. And you could parcel your division out in many different directions in maneuver warfare. In this case, Combat Command Reserve, or CCR, is heading towards the same area east of Bastogne to try and set up roadblocks to buy us time. And because we all know the Germans are moving for Bastogne. Why do they need Bastogne? It's a crossroads town that they need as a pivot point. And I've argued in this book that Bastogne really is much more value to them earlier in the game rather than later. Why? Because the whole point of their offensive is to move north and to get to Antwerp. So Bastogne can help them do that. When it becomes this sort of prestige objective during the siege, that's a completely different animal. So the name of the game is to buy time, and that could mean our lives thrown into the maw to buy that time for others to get there. That's what the situation we're looking at by December 18th, because by then, Fuller and his guys are pretty much gone down, and we're getting anybody we can to throw into the battle in the Bastogne corridor.
Thanks for that, John. And then on the German side, on the 19th, you have General Fritz Bayerlein, forgive the pronunciation for anyone, that's, German speaking out there. So, but he's leading the vanguard of the Panzer Lehr division. And at this point, what is he considering? And how does this very bloody day unfold? And I'm just conscious, there's so many different threads. You really do weave together so many narratives, especially throughout this period. So kudos on that. But any thoughts on this day, John?
Thanks. I mean, that really was the challenge, all these different threads to weave it together and to make it somehow some kind of coherent narrative. And I realize that's maybe a very artificial, historical looking back thing. You wouldn't maybe have experienced it that way, but my hope was to bring to life, a sense of what each of these guys is experiencing in their own little part of this battlefield. And so in this case, Panzer Lehr, which is a pretty potent unit, which is sort of on the southern part of that German advance towards Bastogne, what we're calling the Bastogne corridor, from the Aure River in Luxembourg through Clervaux, westward into Belgium, and then ultimately to Bastogne. And so he's in a situation where he's got kind of like the spear point, almost reconnaissance side of his division, which is an armored division, not as powerful as it had been in Normandy when he commanded it there, because it obviously had been terribly degraded by Allied firepower, but still a pretty potent beast. And he has to figure out, am I strong enough and are they weak enough that I can make a quick push into Bastogne with my vanguard, whatever I can scrape together? And he is he's partially put off the track by some bogus directions from a Belgian civilians, which takes them down into a kind of a narrow one-lane muddy road, which really is not a good place for an armored unit to be. But also, too, he's making this decision in the context of the arrival of other American units around Bastogne, most famously the 101st, that's starting to beef up our defenses there. And let's say he does sort of knife into the town. This is going to be a pretty vulnerable spear point of an advance. So Bayerlein, this is not necessarily his finest moment. There's a lot of fog of war for him to make this decision. And ultimately, he's not terribly aggressive.
And we're closing in on Christmas now, moving to December 20th. You describe the actions of a unit called Team Cherry from Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division. And you describe it like this. Team Cherry has seriously impeded German attempts to capture Bastogne. The team had been cut off, cut up, and battered. But it was now back in the Bastogne perimeter, ready to continue the fight. Cherry knew he has done his job, but could not help but resent the way that his unit had been thrown into battle. Again, John, another powerful passage that really underscores how desperate the situation was for these troops. Could you be our guide and take us through what happened that day?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack with this one. So, as the 110th Infantry has more or less fought to extinction, let's say by the end of the day on December 18th. Now, you have guys who are still out there, who have been bypassed, who maybe are about to be captured. You've got other guys who are getting away to the west, hooking up with other elements of the division, getting to Bastogne, whatever. You've also had CCR, the 9th Armored, basically fight for about 6 to 8 crucial hours, like on December 18th and 19th, especially that epicenter. They have held key crossroads that has denied the Germans time to grab Bastogne at that moment. Now, this buys time for the 101st to get there in place by December 19th, and Combat Command B of the 10th Armored, of which Team Cherry is a part. So when Combat Command B of the 10th Armored gets into the vicinity of Bastogne, later on December 19th, it's parceled up into 3 teams. Henry Cherry, who's a tank battalion commander, is called Team Cherry. It's like combined arms, though. He's got armor and infantry and engineers. He's got some self-propelled artillery. And they're like in a column, on the road leading out of Bastogne. And so they're right in the way when the Germans are moving towards that, on that road trying to get to Bastogne. To their north, he's in the center. Team O'Hara is to the extreme south under one of the infantry battalion commanders. They're going to hold the southern environs, mainly against Panzer-Lehr. And then in the north, in a town called Neuville, Team Desabry, which is also combined infantry and armor and ultimately includes paratroops in the 101st, are going to hold on to Neuville for the better part of a couple of days against the 2nd Panzer Division, which is a pretty powerful unit, and they're going to really inflict terrible damage. So in the case of Cherry, he resented the way his unit had been used because he's an armor commander and he thinks, we need to be maneuvering, and it's tank warfare, and that's how we need to fight and counterattack. He doesn't quite grasp that this is how they're most needed, to be thrown into the fray right there to get in the way of the Germans and do what they can to buy time. So they do exactly that, and they perform very, very well.
And that's a theme that comes out throughout, John, is that they did really well. And in many ways, your book is a revisionist history, and in the postscript, you make quite a strong and compelling argument for why the 110th Regiment deserved consideration for a unit citation. I know Max and I, in our very, very small way, we certainly support this. And, we'll put it out to our listeners to see if they're going to give us at least an online stamp of approval for that citation. We activists in that way for those military narratives, especially the ones that have been lost a little bit along the way for the usual bureaucratic and whatever other reasons. And we will, of course, add links to in the show notes for that. But could you, just before we wrap up, give us a little bit of context around that last episode?
Yeah, it's really sad, actually, because the 110th fights with as much valor as I can think of for any infantry regiment in the U.S. Army in a defensive battle in World War II. I mean, they cost the Germans in that sector, on some level, they cost them Bastogne. They cost them time that they can't afford, and they largely fight as hard as you can fight, and the regiment basically fights to extinction. Fuller gets captured, a terrible experience for him and so many hundreds of others. But when you have the boards that are convening later and deciding on presidential unit citations and all that, a lot of the folks who were on that board just simply didn't quite understand the nuts and bolts of the battle the 110th had fought. I mean, one of them was the famous combat historian S.L.A. Marshall, who certainly had a great deal of influence and had interviewed. He and his guys had done some of the combat interviews with the 101st Airborne survivors. That's one of the reasons why we know that part of the battle so well, and it's great stuff. But he had the impression that this was one of the units that had just kind of folded the tent and caved in and surrendered. We had an unfortunate situation with the 106th Infantry Division a little farther to the north, which 2 of the regiments basically got surrounded and had to surrender. So he was under the impression the same thing had happened here, and so just kind of sloughed this off. The board did. And it's kind of hard to come back from that through the Army bureaucracy. Even all these years later, you guys know. I mean, you know how that works. And so it's really been an uphill battle ever since to kind of get a re-examination of what really happened. And I was hoping that maybe Alamo and the Ardennes would help a little bit in that regard. Unfortunately, it's too late now for the veterans to know any of this. Almost all of them are gone. I was hoping at the time maybe there'd be some sort of re-examination, but, that sort of thing, you guys know, it's beyond your control. It can be quite, circumstantial. But I do think if we're going to remember this in any way, that we kind of revise our view of the Bastogne battle. And we see the 2 phases, the race for Bastogne, which to me is the key point, because as I've argued, Bastogne means much more to the Germans earlier on than later. And then there's the siege, which is no fun for the people who are a part of it, of course. They're amazing. They fight hard. And they're not just 101st. It's remnants of 28th Division. It's African-American artillery units, too, by the way. And then obviously CCB and the 10th Armored, whatever remains after those fights. So I think everyone deserves a heck of a lot of credit, because in that part of the Ardennes, American units, I think, by and large, fought very, very well to foil that aspect of the German offensive.
Oh, absolutely. And we completely agree. And we'll be beating the drum for the 110th. I'll be honest, it's not something I knew much about. It's really been great. Max and I really enjoyed working through it. And on your last point there, John, you just hit the nail on the head. Once, any kind of military just gets a certain direction, it's not even turning the Titanic. It's like, you'd need a divine intervention. Just in a very minor footnote, not even deserving to be close to this discussion about Alamo and the Ardennes. I remember many years back when I was in the South African Army, and I did this navigation course, and I had to leave one day early for legitimate reasons to go back to a unit, and I had to do the test early, do whatever. And I passed the test, and I go back, and then a few months later, I get called in by someone, you need to go back to do it because you've been returned to unit early. And I was like, no, I wasn't. I passed the course, and this small thing you'd think would be sorted out within the hour. Nope. So until today, that if you drop my record, I would have failed a certain course or been returned to units. So just imagine, obviously I'm comparing two things that are impossible to compare, but just on your point, it's like some sort of bureaucratic thing. And if you're going against it, you're almost like rocking the boat, if you know what I mean. Max, I'm not sure, I want to bring you both in, but I'm not sure if that's your experience also, Max.
Absolutely. And that is why it is so important we keep highlighting stories like these. Even if the official recognition is stuck somewhere in bureaucracy, we can make sure these sacrifices aren't forgotten. John, it's been fantastic having you on today, and I genuinely hope we can have you back to talk about the Pacific Theater sometime soon. I've read several of your books on that front myself, and I think people don't talk enough about the Pacific these days.
I agree. Yeah, I'd love to come back. I'd appreciate that very much. Fascinating stuff.
No, for us, it's a great pleasure and an honor, John. And just going towards the closing now, a big thank you. It's really been a wonderful talk for us. And as Max and I often say, it's such a privilege because we get to sit, in a virtual room with you and talk this through. And we really do hope our listeners enjoy it too. We're keen to get feedback from the listeners, especially on the 110th citation. Let's get the word out there for the little bit that we can do for these brave soldiers that did their part. And then a big thank you to you again, John.
I appreciate you guys having me on. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.